I've wanted to wood turn an Easter egg. I was wondering what kind of pattern to do, and my wife mentioned Ukrainian eggs and thought that I should look those up. So I did, and wow, there's a lot to look at. And I got a lot of good ideas for patterning and a lot of stuff that would really work with segmented wood turning. I sketched through a few things, and I finally arrived at an X pattern that I liked, that I could do with different colors of wood. So I started getting that wood ready, and I decided on walnut and maple and purple heart, and I think red heart, but it's possibly Padauk, just because that's what I think I have in the shop. I cut it into strips. And what I was going to do is glue the strips back together again with the different colors of wood, and I could then slice those up and reattach them and make that X pattern. So I could glue the strips together. And once the strips were glued together, I could clean up the side where they were attached, make it a perfectly flush surface. So it passed through the joiner, and then it passed through the planer. And I could cut the strip down to size. Now, I was going to have to cut the strip at a 45-degree angle. So I found I was going to have to modify my sled, which is why there's a chunk cut out of it. So I cut a piece off the leading face of the sled. And I screwed a fence to the bed of the sled at a 45-degree angle. And I attached a hold down. And I realized pretty quickly I was going to need a stop so that all my pieces would be the same width. And because of the 45-degree angle, it couldn't just be a block of wood. I had to cut a specific shape. Once it was all set up, it went pretty quickly. And I could slice my strips into little pieces that were all exactly the same. So you can see how those pieces go together to make the X pattern. Now I can glue the X's together. The first thing to glue is each half of each side. This took all of my little clamps in the shop. Now I need to cut a little triangle that fits within the sides of the X. I'll make that out of walnut. And I clean those up on the sander. So I can glue the X's together first. And I'll use a hose clamp to hold the pieces in place. I can carefully put the hose clamp on. I need to put it on sort of loose and then move the pieces of the X around to where the center is lined up without any gaps in the seams. And then my little triangles in the corners will also help find the spot where it needs to be as the glue sets up. So I needed to do both the X and the little triangles at the same time. And I didn't have a clamp to hold the triangles in place, so I just used tape, and that worked just fine. Now I started making the strips for the rings that'll make up the rest of the egg. So the X's are sort of the main body of the egg, and then the two ends will be rings. I made the strips out of a pair of pieces of wood, so that there'd be a thick piece and then a thin piece with some color. So with the thin piece, it helped to clamp everything together at once, so that I wouldn't get so much bending and flexing in the thin pieces. Then I could take the X's apart, and I could clean them up, and I can cut off the extra bits of the X and get to a square. Now, it was at this point that the project had to stop. So at this point in the project, I had to stop to start working on our kitchen last year. So now it's a year later, And the project's been sitting in a box for a year, and I've kind of forgotten what I was doing. I know what these are obviously the main ring on the egg, but it was what I was going to be doing at each end that I've kind of forgotten. I've got some pieces that I made, and I have some hints, but I'm going to have to figure it out at this point. So I have the main pieces I've been working on. And I have 12 of these little short pieces. And I wondered if I'd thought I was going to put them in between, but I don't think so. I think they were probably supposed to be on the end, or the top and the bottom. This will get cut off, obviously. And then I have some walnut and some more maple. I'm wondering if I was going to do something like that. But this seems kind of weird, so I might do that and then have a little piece of walnut right there. That makes it look kind of more continuous. When I started trying to actually build this idea, it ended up seeming just too finicky, and there were going to be too many little pieces, and getting it all tight and to look nice was going to just be too difficult. So I ended up just doing rings at the ends. I cut the angles into the X pieces, and I glued that together as a ring. And the angle of my blade when I was cutting those wasn't quite perfect, so I did the ring as two halves, or I glued it as two halves to begin with, and then sanded the two halves, and then glued the two halves together, so the seam would be nice and tight. Now I can start making the rings for the two ends of the egg. I've made a new sled, which I hope to have a video up about soon, but at this point I'll just use it. With this sled, it's got two fences, and you go back and forth as you cut the segments, and it gives you a really accurate segment. In fact, I can now do a ring with a solid center, and I don't have to drill a center out. I can glue up the different rings. And then once they dry, I can sand each face. Then the rings can get glued together and start to make the form of the egg. And I used my bowl clamp in the beginning. And then once I got towards the ends where I didn't have a hole in the rings, I could just use a regular clamp. Now to hold this on the lathe, I thought I would use 2 scrap pieces of wood glued to each end. So I cut out some circles, and I can glue those pieces to each end so that the lathe will have something to hold on to. And it'll give me something to cut away as I'm forming the ends of the egg. And I tried some different clamps for these. This I think actually works a little better. They don't slide around as much. I'll let that dry. And now we're ready to turn. I can put it in the lathe. And really turning this shape, it's simpler than a bowl because there isn't an inside and an outside. It's just turning a big fat spindle. It was really just finding the form of the egg within the pieces that I had glued together. I had thought about making it hollow and having it come apart, but for this one I just kept it simple and just made an outer form. Now at this point the surface of the egg is actually round, but the pattern moves a little bit as the form is turning, which you don't see when it's not turning. And I could finish up the basic shape of the egg and then sand, and I could sand all the way through. I think I went up to 600 grit. I think actually in the end, I'm not going to put a finish on it because it looks nice just as the wood. Once the basic shape was done, I could work on the two ends. The tricky part on this project is actually the ends of the egg. The first end, the end that I had at the tailstock, wasn't too hard because I could just use the chuck at the headstock to hold the egg in place and carefully work on that end and get it finished. But the real challenge was going to be doing the other end. Because how do you hold a round surface without scratching it? So what I've seen done, and I've never done it before, is to make a jam chuck. And it's basically a piece of wood that's turned close to the shape of your project, and you just jam your project into it, and it holds it in place. So I found a big hunk of maple that I have, wasn't using for anything. I cut it down and then cut it into a circle, and I could attach a faceplate to that circle, and that circle of maple will then become the chuck. So I can make it round and clean it up, and I have to cut a shape into that piece of maple that will hold the egg. So it took a lot of cutting a little bit and checking and cutting a little bit and checking. And it seemed daunting, but actually cutting the piece of wood out and doing the turning probably only took about half an hour to make this. And it was free. It wasn't some specialty thing I had to order. And it ended up working. So I can push the egg into the chuck with the tailstock and hold it in place with the tailstock. Then turn off the bit that I had held in the chuck earlier, which is really a matter of cutting it down and then sawing off what was left and then moving the tailstock and turning a little bit more off and then cutting a little more off with the saw and sort of getting closer and closer to the final shape of the egg. I could tell at this point that the chuck was holding it in place pretty well. So I got the piece down to where the end was just as small as I could get it with the tailstock in place. Then I could take the tailstock off and out of the way and very carefully turn the end of the egg. So it's only being held in place by the friction of the jam chuck. And I made a point of trying to push the scraper towards the headstock so that I wasn't pushing on the egg from side to side. Because the fear at this point is it's the very last little bit, and this is the point when it's going to come flying out and break. With some very careful scraping, it worked. Then you can see it's just held in place with a little friction. It's done. One egg. So the thought I had as far as a tradition with this is to maybe have someone, like my parents, hide the egg in our house somewhere on Easter, and hide it well enough that we don't find it for a few months maybe. Then the first person who finds it gets something. I don't know, we'll need to figure out what that is. So I like it in the end, but I think I could have done a better job between the main X pattern and the rings on each end of the egg. Like those two things should have talked to each other a little more. And I think where I did the maple next to the X pattern works a lot better than where I did the walnut, because you get these floating maple pieces in the pattern. But it was all sort of a big experiment. Thanks for watching. I'm going to be in Atlanta next weekend, so the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of April at the woodworking shows. I'll put a link down below. So if you're in the Atlanta area, you can stop by and say hi.